Well, welcome everyone. Good evening, and thank you for all coming out on such a cold night to tonight's event, which we're calling Unlocking Property in Science. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Adelaide, Waite and Roseworthy are built. My name is Emma Baker. At the university, I'm the Professor of Housing Research and Director of the Australian Centre for Housing Research. So we're a fairly broad group. We do a whole lot of research that's a little bit different to Peter's talk tonight. We look at the rental sector. We're really interested in housing affordability and healthy housing. I'm standing in tonight as MC for what some of the regulars in this room will remember, Hayley Parkinson, who unfortunately couldn't make it tonight. So, the residential property market remains the most popular option for Australians looking to invest their hard-earned savings, but knowing when and where to take the leap into home ownership or property investment is challenging. So, we're in an absolute peak of rising interest rates and inflation and many conflicting options. And I guess what many of us are thinking is, how can we make well-informed decisions about the best place and time to invest in a house? So during tonight's event, you're going to hear from Peter Koulizos. Peter has been teaching real estate and property investment for over 25 years, and we're lucky enough in the last few years to have him at the University of Adelaide, where he's developed and run a really successful master's degree in property. A little bit of structure for the night. Following Peter's presentation, you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions, and we'll take questions from the audience. We've taken some questions from you in advance of tonight's event, and we'll also take some live questions from the 300 or 400 people who are joining us online. So let's get underway. I'm so pleased to introduce you to our speaker, Peter Koulizos, and please join me in welcoming Peter.
Thank you very much, Emma, for that lovely introduction. Firstly, may I say how wonderful it is to see so many familiar faces. Many of my past students are here, many of my current students are here are good, which is great. So tonight's presentation is really geared for the general public. So look, provided you can add, take, multiply, divide and do percentages, you should be able to do similar research to what I'm presenting, if that's of interest to you to see how, g'day Don, to see how things progress in the future. All right, so there we go. So there's the outline of my presentation tonight. A number of different topics, research that I've done recently, but it's also research that you can do. Right at the end, I've got some websites that you can go to. So a lot of the data that I use is free and easily accessible. So there's a great opportunity for you to do something similar if you want to do it yourself. And there's also an opportunity if you want to learn about investing in property or property valuation or property development, there is also an opportunity which I'll talk more about later on. All right, property market snapshot. So what I want you to focus on in this slide is over here on the left-hand side, how big residential real estate is as an asset. So tonight I'm talking about property as an asset, as an investment, as a commodity, but also as a home. So when you put all the money that we all have invested in super and the stock market and commercial real estate, it's still not as much as residential real estate. So residential real estate is a huge asset class, and it probably is too big to fail. Banks understand that because they've lent us a lot of money on that. So we all have an interest in making sure that the market doesn't fail. Most recent median prices from CoreLogic. So Sydney, despite the slight decrease in the last 12 months, still has a medium dwelling price of over $1 million. So the difference here is dwellings include houses and units. So this is all combined. So if it was just houses, it would actually be more than $1,031,000. Second is Canberra, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Adelaide. So Adelaide has just beaten Hobart so far as median dwelling price is concerned, and that's mainly due to the fact that Adelaide property prices increased exponentially during COVID, and of late, Hobart property prices have come down. This is what's happened over the last year. So the previous slide is where we are now. This is what's happened in the last year, and I want you to take particular note of Perth and Adelaide, and also regional Western Australia and regional South Australia. So going back a little bit further in history, this is where we are today. This is what's happened to the property market. 2022 to 2023, it's dropped by almost 10%. Not the longest and the worst drop in property prices. 2017 to 2019 was the worst, and I'll come back to why that was. So here, 1989 to 1991, dropped by 6%. Recession, 2010 to 2012. Let's go here. 2008 to 2009, immediately after the GFC, we were stunned. Then we had stimulus. Stimulus ran out, and then property prices dropped 2010 to 2012. Now here, there was no huge increase in interest rates, no economic shocks. It was really the availability of credit. I don't know if you remember, but if you try to get a loan back then, the bank was looking at how many Uber Eats you did, what was your gym membership like, all of those sorts of things. So it was like forensic finance. So it was very tough to get a loan, and that's one of the keys to increasing property prices is the availability of credit. It was quite restricted back then, hence why property prices dropped. So why haven't they crashed yet? So we've been through COVID, we've had 11 increases in interest rates. Why haven't they dropped? Bottom left-hand number. Because there is hardly any properties to buy. So that for those of you that have done economics, you'll understand that the price of something is a function of demand and supply. It's not like lots of us want to go out and buy property. It's that for those of us that want to buy property, there is hardly anything to buy. So 25% below the 5-year average has had a significant impact. It's been like a big safety net on property prices. And I'd asked you before to keep an eye on Perth and Adelaide and regional Western Australia and regional South Australia, because remember, demand and supply equals price. So the number of properties for sale in rest of South Australia and the rest of Western Australia outside Perth is much lower than any other region. So it makes sense. If there's hardly any properties to buy, even if you keep demand stable, price is going to go up. And same here. Perth, 16% lower listings than 12 months ago. Adelaide, 6% approximately, hence why property prices have still been quite good. Sydney and Melbourne, their property prices are increasing at the minute, despite 11 increases in interest rate. All right, interest rates. Because some people think that the property market or property prices is all about interest rates. I hope to dismiss that myth. Let's have a look. So I went back 30 years to when interest rates have increased at least 3 times. And what happened to property prices? Because the theory is if interest rates increase, property prices fall. So June 94 to December 94, only 6 months, but I went up 2.75% in that time. Property prices still went up 1.1%. 6 months, 1.1%, not much. Next period, September 99 to September 2000, that's 1 year. Interest rates went up 1.5%, property prices went up 7.5%. March 2002 to December 2003, so before the COVID property boom, this was the last national property boom, back in 2001, 2 and 3. The Reserve Bank of Australia wanted to increase interest rates to calm the property market. Did they do so? Well, in that 1 3/4 years, property prices went up 35.7%. March 2006 to December 2006, another 9 months, property prices went up 0.75%. Interest rates went up 0.75%. Property prices still went up. Same in June, 9 months, interest rates went up 1%. Property prices went up. September 2009 to December 2010, 1.25 years, interest rates go up, property prices go up. It's supposed to be the other way around. Remember, interest rates go up, property prices go down. And then we come to where we are today. March 2002 to December 2022, just in that three quarters of a year period, interest rates went up 3%. Finally, property prices have come down. But you can imagine if interest rates go up 11 times, then that is going to have a significant impact on property prices. So for most of the time, interest rates haven't had the significant impact that they thought it would, because when I try and explain the property market, I try and use the analogy of a garden. So when you water something in a garden, it doesn't automatically mean that it's going to be healthy. Same with the property market. There is a lot of inputs. So you've got interest rates, you've got consumer confidence, you've got availability of credit, you've got supply, you've got all of these other factors, and certainly interest rates is one of them. Here I've got some question marks, because if I was doing this presentation 2 Tuesdays ago, I would have thought, well, it's all over. Interest rate rises are all over. But as we discovered last week, they are not. So the worst is over, but it's not all over. So how many more to come? I'm not exactly sure. How much more have property prices got to fall? I'm not exactly sure. But I also want to show you the converse. September 90 to June 1994, so almost 4 years, over 4 years, the cash rate dropped by 9.75%. That's almost 10%. That's almost 1,000 basis points. Went from 14% to 4.75%. And you would think with that sort of stimulus, property prices would go crazy, but they didn't. They only went up 10.8%. Why? If you remember back then, we had the recession. So there were many other things happening in our lives and in the economy, and obviously they dropped interest rates to try and stimulate the economy and the property market. Did it do it? Well, 10% over almost 4 years is well below the average, but just imagine what would have happened if they didn't do it. And conversely, just imagine if they didn't increase interest rates, especially back here when we were having the property boom, what may have happened to property prices. So the point there is, it's not just about interest rates. There are many other factors that affect property prices. All right, so at the moment, there's a lot of news about rent. So from the tenant's perspective, I'm not looking here from the investor's perspective, it's from the tenant's perspective that rents are skyrocketing. Why? Well, I want you to keep this date in mind, February 2017. So on this date, the portion of new lending for investment housing dropped away. COVID came, interest rates went down, then it went up again. But when you look at this period here, for most of the time, we are below the average. Whereas for the previous 8 years, most of the time, the investor lending was above the average. So in simple terms, if property investors cannot borrow money to buy an investment property, then it does not provide a house for a potential tenant. So finance went down. Let's have a look at this one here. So this breaks it up into the different states. Again, the colours aren't that important, but the date is February 2017, where basically finance started to drop away, and then it's come back again. So you might think, well, Peter, it's okay now because it's come back again. But over here on the left-hand side is billions of dollars. If the property prices have increased by 50%, then you would think roughly lending would also increase by 50%. But it hasn't. And so again, there's not as many property investors supplying property for tenants to live in. Now here's a website that you can use. I've got the link in one of the latter slides. So have a look at here. This is vacancy rates. February 2017, dropped away in Adelaide. In Perth, the same. In Brisbane, the same. Nationally, it doesn't show up as much because nationally, when we include Sydney and Melbourne, there are other factors. Airbnb, foreign investment, which don't play as big a role in cities like Adelaide and Brisbane. But again, February 17 seems to be a key date. So why February 17? You remember the Royal Commission that we had? Around that time was also when APRA told the banks, if you want to lend to investors, they have to have a 10% deposit and not a 5% deposit like owner-occupiers. If you want to lend to investors, they have to pay 0.5% more in interest than owner-occupiers. It was harder for investors to borrow, therefore they didn't borrow to either buy or supply new property. Hence, the situation that we are in now has been like 6 years in the making. There are other factors which I'll go through shortly, but that's a really big one. And as you saw, February 17 was a key date for many of those factors, for lending, for vacancy rates, just phenomenal. All right, so how bad is the shortfall? So here's a graph that I got from CoreLogic, which says at the moment there are 4,000 listings and the average, 5-year average is 7,000. 3,000 dwellings. Is that all? That can't be right. So then I went to the SQM website and had a look. Yep, where we are today and the average is a difference of about 3,000 dwellings. Nah, can't be right. So I rang Tim Lawless, who's the head of research of CoreLogic, and I said, Tim, would I be right in assuming that if we just had an extra 3,000 listings, then we would go a long way to helping resolving the problem in Adelaide? That's correct. 3,000 dwellings. When there's probably close to 1 million dwellings in Adelaide, all we need is 3,000. That seems like a low number compared to 1 million, but to create 3,000 new dwellings takes a long time because generally in South Australia, we build about 10,000 new dwellings a year. So you could say, well, that's only an increase in 30%. Well, you've got to find 30% more labour. Good luck doing that. 30% more construction materials. So what we say in property and property economics is the supply of housing is inelastic. It's like you can't snap your fingers and things change. The demand for housing is very elastic because you can snap your fingers and things change. Like if in the budget tonight, they announce a first home buyer initiative, which starts tomorrow, demand for property increases tomorrow. You can't do that with supply because supply takes a long time to come on. So it doesn't seem like a lot. So what we've got here, the factors that have created the situation that we're in, tighter lending to property investors selling their rental properties. Now, many investors, just like owner-occupiers, were the beneficiaries of big increases in property prices. So many of them sold those properties and they went to owner-occupiers, which is lovely, but then there's less rental properties for people to tenant. Airbnb has played a role, certainly in places like Sydney and Melbourne, and also southeast Queensland. At the moment, the influx of overseas migrants, because we've got to make up for lost time, because during COVID hardly anyone was coming over, so that's putting pressure on rents. Influx of international students, but they have a second option. They can go and stay in purpose-built student accommodation rather than a typical suburban home. And also changes in residential tenancies legislation, where it's not so much in South Australia yet anyway, but in other states, it's just making it harder. The perception is for investors, it's harder to hold on to rental property because things are changing more in favour of the tenant. And so their perception is their reality, and so some of them decide to sell. Again, less rental properties. In Australia, where most rental property is supplied by mum and dads, and most mum and dad investors only own 1 or 2 investment properties, it's critical that we keep that in mind because yes, one of the answers is social and affordable housing. But to bring on new social and to bring on any sort of housing, whether it's social and affordable or whether it's just private rental, takes a lot of time. So we need many different solutions. What are the answers? Yes, more social and affordable housing. Build to rent. So this is where large corporations come in, build a large block of apartments just for people to rent. This is one of the answers, but it's not the total solution, because the issue with build to rent is they're in apartment blocks that have many common facilities, gymnasium, cafe, common lounge, where somebody's got to pay for all these facilities, and it's generally the tenant. So typically a tenant that lives in a build to rent property pays relatively more than somebody who was in a non-build to rent property. And also rent to buy, where people are coming off the rental carousel. So the idea is you rent this property and you have the option to buy this property at some stage in the future. But the ones that I really like are where Australians are helping Australians, because build to rent is generally going to be international corporations. But we can help each other. How? Granny flats. In South Australia, basically you're not allowed to rent your granny flat out. You can have your granny live there, or another relative or a friend, but you can't rent it out. Now, in other states, they allow you to do that. Now, Professor Baker was telling me just recently, Queensland changed the rules to allow people to rent out their granny flats. How good would that be? I'm not saying that thousands of people need to do it, but even if hundreds of people were allowed to rent out their granny flats in Adelaide, we would go some way towards alleviating the issue. I'm going back in time now, but some of the older people in the room might remember in the old days, people would move from the country for a job in the city, and either because they couldn't afford to rent or they couldn't find a place, they would board. Now, for whatever reason, boarding is not as common as it used to be. So maybe we need to incentivise people to do that, in particular older people. Like if we said, look, if you took on a boarder, then it wouldn't affect your pension up to a certain limit. So these sorts of things can help the situation now. Because if you keep crying out for more and affordable social housing, new housing and new supply, that takes ages. Because that assumes that you've already got the land. If you've already got the land, then maybe if it's a house or a duplex, a year. If it's an apartment, 2 or 3 years. But if you haven't got the land and connected infrastructure to it, it's going to take even longer than that. Where all it takes, in particular granny flats, is for local councils to change that rule. Doesn't have to be forever. It might be for 2 years or 3 years, just till we get over this, because supply sooner or later will catch up. The problem is at the moment, even though the worst of COVID is over, we still have supply issues. How do we know? Anyone try to buy a new car lately? It's taking months to come over, and that's just one commodity. There are many building materials that are still not in the supply that they should be. So there are certainly issues there. I'm not saying that just those things will work, but I think if our local government and state government and federal government all got together, then we could seriously address this issue. All right, property performance. So I know we've got about 300 people online, and they would be from all over Australia, maybe overseas, but I'm assuming that all of us in this room are from Adelaide and South Australia. So how has Adelaide performed over the last 20 years? Well, generally in the papers and in the news, it's all about Melbourne and Sydney property market, going nuts and lots of people moving in, and Sydney's got a median house price of $1 million. Well, let's have a look. So other than Hobart, which has had stellar performance, mainly because they had a huge year back in the early 2000s, and just recently, Adelaide's doing all right. So I was looking for data to make it a nice even 21 years to get to March 2023, but that ABS data doesn't come out till next month. So this is almost 21 years worth. Adelaide property prices have increased just over 4 times. So for all the hullabaloo about what's happening in Sydney and Melbourne, little old Adelaide, under the radar, doing okay. So if you take out Hobart, basically property prices in Australian capital cities have increased somewhere between 3 times and 4 times in that almost 21-year period. One thing I'm often asked, and by the way, tonight's not financial advice. You know that because you're not paying for it. This was a free seminar. All right, this is just general information. Sometimes I'm asked my opinion, not my advice. Peter, should I invest in the city or should I invest in the country? Well, let's have a look. So on the left-hand side, I've got capital cities, right-hand side, regional areas, and how they've performed over the last 20 years or so. So again, we can see not just Hobart, but the whole of Tasmania has had a stellar performance. But let's have a look. Hobart did better than the rest of Tasmania. Adelaide did better than the rest of South Australia. Canberra doesn't really have a regional area, so we don't have that. The city of Darwin had a better performance than the rest of the Northern Territory. However, regional Victoria did better than Melbourne. Regional Queensland did better than Brisbane. Regional New South Wales did better than Sydney. And regional Western Australia did better than Perth. Is the city a better investment choice than the country? I think the jury is still out. Maybe, all right, if we didn't have our crystal balls, maybe to work out that Tasmania was the place to invest in over the last 20 years, if we just invested in places like Ballarat and Bendigo, maybe we could have made a lot of money. But, you know, we're all geniuses in hindsight. But whether capital cities are better than regional areas, still, I would like to do some more research. In particular, the research that I'll be doing is looking at regional area for South Australia. Right, regional areas include places like Victor Harbour, Hayborough, Island Beach on Kangaroo Island, Black Point on the Yorke Peninsula. So all of these lifestyle areas, maybe they increase significantly, but places like Peterborough and Jamestown and Maitland and Cummins, which are inland and not really lifestyle locations, maybe they didn't go up so much. So I'm still doing some research on that to help me come up with an answer. I think what is more definitive is this one. And for all of you that have come to even just one of my classes, you would know that houses are better than units for investment. Why? Because the value in real estate is in the land. So in other words, you need to buy property that has a significant land component, because property is made up of two components, land and building. The building depreciates in value. How do we know that? Well, the ATO allows you depreciation over 40 years, and after 50, 60 years, the buildings are not worth as much as the land that they sit on, and they are knocked down. So it must be the land component that appreciates in value. So let's have a look. In Hobart, houses went up almost 300% in this time period, units 222%. So houses did better. Adelaide, houses did better than units. Canberra, houses did better than units. Darwin is the only place where units did better. Now again, I need to do some more research. I'm pretty sure that's because there are a lot of new units built in Darwin, and when you buy new, you're also incorporating developers' profit, a premium. But more research needs to be done. But Melbourne houses did better than Melbourne units. Brisbane houses better than Brisbane units. Sydney houses better than Sydney units. And Perth houses better than Perth units. So here, these units here, that 100%, if it's gone up 100%, it means it's doubled in value. So in these four capital cities, units did not even double in 20 years, whereas houses certainly outperformed that. So, is it a sure bet that houses are better than units? No. Is it a pretty safe bet? I think so. Okay, now I know many of you here are for this, because 15 years ago I wrote a book on the best suburbs to invest in, and tonight I'm going to be revealing another 7 locations where I think if you're a first home buyer, if you're an investor, even if you're a community housing group and your model is to keep some of the dwellings so they grow in equity and you can build some more somewhere else, this sort of information is really critical. So, but before I do that, I am going to have a look at how well or how poorly my forecast went 15 years ago, because it would only be fair to do that. So my methodology, both quantitative and qualitative analysis. Big words. Quantitative means numbers, so I use a lot of data from the ABS, from CoreLogic, and qualitative, which is more subject, based on opinion. And local knowledge is critical. So the book that I wrote 15 years ago was Top Australian Suburbs, not Top Adelaide Suburbs. And because local knowledge is critical, I visited each of those suburbs around the country just to get a feel for the area. Now, I haven't tested all the other suburbs because I'm looking for a 15-year anniversary and I'm waiting for the March data to come out, which is next month. So the criteria, when I say top suburbs, I mean suburbs that are going to do better than the Adelaide average. And I'm looking for undervalued suburbs, not blue chip. So you won't find Burnside or Toorak Gardens or Glenelg in here, but you will find other suburbs that are up and coming. All right, some of the indicators that I look for specifically South Australian areas, but I mean you could take out the word South Australian and put Australian if you're looking in other, or put the other state if you're looking in other states. Bachelor degree level rate of increase is above the state average because generally people with a degree earn more because you need more money to push property prices up. The rate of income growth is above the state average. So it's not just professionals with degrees that earn a lot of money. Certainly of late, tradies of our side also been earning a lot of money. So don't just look at whether they got a degree or not. You need to look at the income. The proportion of people in a professional occupation is above the state average. Loosely defined, a professional is somebody with a degree. And there's a high proportion of separate houses. So we don't have lots of flats in the area. It's predominantly houses. I'm really keen on gentrification and I've done some research on that. So one of the reasons that property prices improve is because of gentrification. Another one is urban renewal. Another one is urban regeneration. I'm particularly focused on gentrification, which is old becoming new. So basically areas that nobody wanted to live in years ago, but now is very popular. Norwood and Unley are not the popular suburbs, were not the popular suburbs as they are today 40, 50 years ago. Same with Semaphore. The most recent example I can give is Henley Beach. 30 years ago, nobody wanted to live in Henley Beach. Grange, Tennyson, Glenelg, but not Henley Beach. Too scared to even fish off the jetty at night. But now, it's a very different story. So, gentrification. What I'm looking for is greater than the state average decrease in people aged 18 years and under. So basically, gentrification is a childless process. Greater than state average increase in couples without children. Greater than average increase in the percentage of females working in the professional occupations. Not just professionals, but females working in professional occupations. Greater than average decrease in the percentage of government housing. So doesn't mean the amount of government housing is decreasing, because often what will happen is that there's 100 lot public housing. The private sector would do a deal with the public sector, and they'll say, on here you can build 200 houses, but we still want 100. For us, you keep the other 100. So what we're looking for is a decrease in the percentage of government housing which is being replaced by new housing. But this is the bigger one. This is the biggest factor. Greater than average increase in the percentage of people that lived at a different address 5 years ago. One of the reasons that property prices go up is because wealthier people are moving in, or wealthy people are buying in. Because remember, not everyone buys a house to live in permanently. Some are bought as holiday houses. So, property prices in some of our lifestyle areas, like Black Point on the York Peninsula, like Island Beach, haven't skyrocketed because the people that live there suddenly earn more money. It's the richer people are buying in there. So what I'm looking for is a greater than average increase in the percentage of people that lived at a different address 5 years ago. Basically, wealthier people move in, they can afford to pay a higher price, and they do, and they can also afford to renovate and extend their existing homes. Other factors, these are more qualitative factors. Older houses are being renovated and extended rather than demolished and replaced with ultra-modern dwellings. Public art appears on public buildings, on Stobie poles or electricity poles. We call them Stobie poles in South Australia. And amenity appeals that appeal to young professionals moving into the area. Hot yoga, Pilates, organic food stores, craft breweries, small bars. The best example I can give you in Adelaide is Thebarton. So 50 years ago, the Wheatshift Hotel, not 50 years ago, 20 years ago, the Wheatshift Hotel was a blue-collar pub. You'd only find West End Draft and Southwark Bitter. Older people might remember those beers, right? Big screens and horse racing and greyhound racing and football blaring out and the smell of beer, all right? Pokies, you go in there today. Not a pokey to be seen. The only beers they serve are craft beers, and the Wheatshift actually has a microbrewery at the back of it. Jazz band on a Sunday afternoon. Now that tells you that the demographic has changed. So for me, Thebarton is a classic example of an area gentrifying. Very popular with the Greek and the Italian migrants in the 1950s and 60s. They've slowly moved out, and moving in are the white-collar professionals who live in the city, who work in the city. All right, let's see how well or how poorly I did. These are the 20 Adelaide suburbs in my book. Some of them, there was just not enough data to make a reliable comparison, so that's why the NA appears. Adelaide, in this period of time, did 89% increase in house prices. This is the increase in house prices 15 years later. So Exeter is the only one that didn't meet the benchmark of 89. But Exeter only had 13 sales for the whole year. I would prefer to have more data than that for it to be reliable. You might be thinking, well, how many sales do you need, Peter? Well, the answer is it depends. If I was looking at Colonel-like Gardens, where basically everything is a 3 or 4 bedroom bungalow, I may not need as many sales as, say, Brooklyn Park, which has a spattering of character homes, lots of 1950s and 60s homes, some new homes, some homes under the flight path, big mix. And also Kensington, let's not get too excited, there was only 14 sales there. But all the others, I'm pretty confident of, so far as the stats are concerned. So some of the bigger ones, Torrensville 145%, Port Noarlunga South 134%. So really, other than Semaphore Park, everything else at least doubled in value. Because remember, 100% means it's doubled in value, where Adelaide did 89%. Again, is it a sure bet using that methodology? No. Is it a pretty safe bet? I think so. Okay. So keeping that in mind, drum roll. And you'll see that many of these suburbs many of the suburbs that I'm about to present are next door to these suburbs, because one of the keys is being next door to a prime suburb or area. Richmond, median price 770,000. The prime suburbs next door, Torrensville at 900, Mile End at 880, Cowdilla not so much, a little bit more expensive. Why? It's within walking distance of the city, depending on how fit you are. Redevelopment opportunities, ability typically to knock down a 750 square metre, a house on a 750 square metre block and build 3 or 4. But you can also add value through renovating the post-war homes. Be careful. There's a flood zone there. If you're interested in developing, you better check out the flood map. There's a typical house, 70 Milner Road, Richmond, 811,000. So it's a little bit more than the median, but this is on a corner. You could keep the house and chop off the backyard, and you're like 4 k's from town. Underdale, 745,000. Look at these prime suburbs. Lockley's right next door at over $1 million median house price. Torrensville at 900, Flinders Park 821. Why? Close to the city. Henley Beach Road, you head east, you come into the city, head west, get to Henley Beach, and in particular, focus on the character homes. That's where you're going to make your money. The older, the better. 802,000 for 13 Chatswood Grove. If you look at it on Google, it's right across from the River Torrens and the Linear Park. pretty good opportunity there. Marston, 675 median. So we're coming down a little bit of median price. The other more expensive suburbs next door, close to the city, redevelopment opportunities due to favourable zoning, but be careful. One of the reasons I never selected Marston 15 years ago is because of the large amount of industry in the area. It is still there, slowly moving out. So you want to be if you're going to be buying a home or building, you want to be buying it in a residential zone, like a housing diversity neighbourhood zone or a general neighbourhood zone, not in the employment zones. Here in particular is strategic employment, because that's where they want to keep the industry. So in the inner west, there's an example. This one here, if you look at that, if you Google that one, you'll see that they bought that for land value. They're going to split that up and just sell it as 2 blocks. Why did they pay so much for that much land? Because it's relatively close to the city. Kilkenny. Main reason is because it's next door to West Croydon. 920. West Croydon is an anomaly. Why are the median house prices in West Croydon higher than Mile End, which is 1 mile from the city centre, or Torrensville? And Mile End and Torrensville have bigger homes on bigger blocks and wider streets. Now, I can't get solid evidence because I would need to know where the owners of these houses live, but I've been to many auctions in West Croydon and I know many of the sales agents in that area, and it's investors from the eastern states buying property in West Croydon. So we've got Sydney and Melbourne money in the past having bought properties in West Croydon. So the point I'm trying to make here is I can't see the growth in West Croydon continuing, but you can move next door to Kilkenny. Is it close to the city? According to eastern states investors, it is. We may not think so. The key is adjacent to West Croydon, and it's at the early stages of gentrification. And if there's only one photo you remember tonight, it's this one. I'm not saying that this is the best property for you to buy. It's too late because it's already been bought, but it's the character house. All right. If you're looking to make money in property as a residential property investor, it's location, land, and looks. Close to the city or the sea, decent sized block of land, and looks, character. Generally houses built before World War II. Or you have a nice outlook, which means like you've got a view of the sea. West Lake Shore, my God, the median price is huge. But let me give you an example here. But look at the median prices of the neighbouring suburbs, right? Well over $1 million. It's a relatively cheap beachside suburb. The land alone is worth more than the house and land. Early stages of urban regeneration, because West Lake Shore, like West Lakes, was developed back in the 70s. Now those 50-year-old houses aren't worth as much. The land that they sit on is worth much more. And west of Military Road is ideal, but you can expect to pay much more than $1 million for a house there. Here's an example. Bought for $750. So what's happening here for those of you that are interested in development? If you were to chop up that land, you could get $1,400 a square metre for the 375 square metre blocks. But you can buy it at $1,000 or $1,100 a square metre. So that's $300 or $400 a square metre difference. Multiply that by 750. That's a lot of money. So, and why? Location-wise, it's adjacent the sea and also West Lakes itself. So I know it would median price of almost $1 million, very scary, but you can buy properties well below that. Obviously, this was not west of Military Road, but still walking distance to shopping and the lake. All right, a bit cheaper. We get why. One of the reasons is because we're going further away. Seaford. You got Moana next door, almost $100,000 more. Port Noarlunga South and Port Noarlunga, which I listed in my book. And I'm not saying Port Noarlunga South and Port Noarlunga are no good anymore, or those other suburbs that I wrote about. This is just an additional 7 to those 20. Cheap beachside suburb, easy access to the city by train, and only 5 k's to McLaren Vale. And the key there is McLaren Vale has a lot of employment. Yes, it's got lovely wine, but people want to live close to work. Even though these days you don't have to go to work every day because working remotely is okay, or working from home, you still want to be relatively close. and they're 720,000, but it's only four houses from the beach. I'm not saying that all of these properties that I'm showing you that we have photos of are the ideal investment, the ideal home. This is just an example of what you can buy. And if your budget is a lot less than that, then you should go to the country. So, Ardrossan on the Central York Peninsula, the main reason is not because it's next door to Port Vincent, which is more expensive. The main reason is Rex Minerals Hillside Mine. You may not know, but a copper mine has been approved in Ardrossan. It was approved many years ago, but they're actually starting works now on the road. So there will be hundreds of workers moving in to Ardrossan. But along with hundreds of workers, you need extra people in the supermarket, extra teachers, extra medical staff, extra clean, all of these, like the employment factor is like times 3. So you need thousands of people, not just living in Ardrossan, but on the Central York Peninsula. You go to realestate.com.au today, there's only a dozen properties for rent on the whole peninsula. Only one within 50 k's of Ardrossan. And you can't snap your fingers and create new housing. So I think the opportunities are there, even if you're going to build, but if you're going to build, you need to keep. And just let property prices go up. Okay, so there are my 7. I don't know if I'll be invited back in 15 years' time to see how well they've done. But that's my humble opinion. And that's what you can get. That's what recently sold in Ardrossan. 305,000, almost 1,600 square metres. I'm not putting that size up because of the subdivision potential. Because there's no main sewerage, the minimum size often is only 1,200 square metres. But that's a lot of land for $300,000. And it's a coastal town, so it's survived already because it's a place where people go to retire, people go to holiday, people live there permanently, farmers use it as a service centre. So mining is just a bonus. There's already mining there, there's a dolomite mine there. So the township is well acquainted with mining. So good opportunities there. Summary, because Emma's given me the 2 minutes, or piece, I'm not sure, I think it's 2 minutes. Mainly due to a lack of supply of property for sale, the residential property market experienced significant increases in price and is undergoing a correction at the moment due to steeply rising interest rates. There's more to residential property than just interest rates. Mainly due to a lack of property for rent, rents have also increased significantly in the last 12 to 18 months. I did research middle of last year. From June 2012 to June 2022, inflation went up 26%. Rents in that 10-year period went up 11%. So even when you include the extra inflation, the extra increases in rents, in the last 12 months, rents have not kept pace with inflation. It's the rate of increase that is remarkable. Same with the rate of increase in property prices. If property prices went up 7% per annum every year, probably wouldn't hit the headlines. But when it gets to 20% or 25%, or goes backwards, then it does hit the headlines. Adelaide properties performed exceptionally well. Not sure if it's better to invest it in the city than the country. I'm pretty sure it's better to invest in houses rather than units. And if you follow a few simple steps, you too can pick up the up and coming suburbs. If you want to do it yourself, these are the websites, just some of the websites you can use. I particularly like the OECD data because then I compare Australia with what's happening in the rest of the world. But really, the reason we all wanted you to come tonight is because we all want you to roll in the subject. So, the Introduction to Property and Valuation, yes, is a core course in the Master of Property, but I've also made it non-award. So you don't need any qualifications to do this course. You don't need to do the assignments or the tests or the exams. Just sit in and listen. And probably the key component is a field trip where we go and visit the best suburbs. And I try and explain to the students or show the students what I've tried to explain in class. What makes a good suburb? What makes a good street? What makes a good property? So that's the sales pitch for tonight. I don't know how well I did, but that's the sales pitch for tonight. And I've gone 4 minutes over time. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I was incredibly torn because I think most people would rather just listen to another 10 minutes of Peter, but we've got some questions that some of you have put in before, and we'll call for some questions from the audience and also from the web. One of the things they've asked me to just kind of mention again is, don't ask a personal finance question. Peter will give general answers. But I'm going to take a little bit of privilege here. So, Peter, you looked back, forward. So if you're looking forward, 2038, go on, give us one, you reckon?
2038?
Yeah, go forward 15 years.
Right.
That's totally unfair.
I will give you an answer by the end of the night.
Okay.
I will give you an answer by the end of the night. Because I can do two things at once. I can speak and think at the same time. Maybe not very well.
So, look, I have some pre-prepared questions, but okay, I'll give you one from the pre-prepared, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Someone's put in a question about the housing bubble. So, if we're heading towards a housing bubble, what's a housing bubble actually, and what are the things that could cause it to burst?
Okay, very good question. My question back to that person that asked that is, so let's have a look at what happened to previous housing bubbles in Australia, and that'll give us an indication what's going to happen in the future. That will be an impossible question to answer because we've never had a housing bubble before. A housing bubble assumes that you're going to have a housing crash. Now, I showed you how much property prices have dropped over the last 40, 50 years. Now, the worst was 10%, which was just a few years ago, and that was over a 2-year period. Because a lot of overseas economists will come and do a study tour in Australia and say the property market's going to crash by 40%. Remember that? There was a famous bet I remember, and the loser had to walk up to Mount Kosciuszko. Remember that one? What they don't understand is most housing is a home. It's not an investment. They don't really care what the capital growth potential might be, what the rent potential might be. Is it in my kid's school zone? Does it have 3 or 4 bedrooms? Is it close to the facilities I want? Okay, then that'll be fine. And the last thing an Australian is going to do is sell their home. Unlike in the US, where they have different sorts of loans and you can basically leave your keys on the kitchen bench and walk out and the bank's not going to come after you to collect any money that you owe them, we will give up many other things before we give up our home. And the one saving grace we have this time, Emma, unlike the 90s when we did have more than 10% inflation, more than 10% interest rates, more than 10% unemployment, is employment. The reason you are panicked to sell is you don't have a job to make up the mortgage repayments. If you've got a job, it's not as big a deal. So I can't answer that question on bubbles because I haven't seen an Australian housing bubble yet.
I love that answer. We've got some roving microphones that are kind of primed to run to you if you put your hand up. Does anyone want to lead us off? I've got a whole stack of questions I can keep asking, but does anyone want to lead us off with a question for Peter directly? Or there's one at the back. And you can keep pondering 15 years.
Okay, I will.
I appreciate this is not the scope of this lecture, but what I'm more concerned about is for the first-time owner-occupier who isn't necessarily that flush with cash, but they just want something simple, small. They just want a house of their own. I appreciate that this is more of an investment, to give scope on investment, but for the first-time owner-occupier, do you have any advice or anything that you would like to point them, in a general direction for where they might want to start?
For sure. So the key for a first home buyer, if you're looking to buy a second, bigger or better home, is to make sure that your first home is in the right location. Now, because the budget is an issue, all right, you probably won't be able to buy in Torrensville or Thebarton or Myland or West Croydon, but there are other areas not so close to the city or the sea that still have potential, maybe because of infrastructure, maybe because the train has been extended there, or the tram. So the key is to look into the future, but again, buying a house, you're far better off buying an older type house that needs work rather than a unit. And if there's only one thing that you remember from this lecture, as my students would know, you never buy a new apartment because there is no growth or negative growth. So the worst thing, sir, a first home buyer could do is buy a brand new apartment. Even though they are very affordable, when I say very affordable, quite cheap, you've got big body corporate fees, and because most of what they have spent goes towards the building, which depreciates in value, they're going to be losing money. So first home buyers in the room or first home buyers online, have a look at houses close to infrastructure, in particular infrastructure that may improve into the future, and don't be scared to get your hands dirty if it needs a coat of paint or new floor coverings or window dressings. That's what I would suggest. And save money. You need to save money, obviously. 5% deposit. When I speak to my international students and I say you only need a 5% deposit to get a house, it's unbelievable. Many other countries around the world, you need much more than that. Anybody else?
There's one down the front.
Generally, would you recommend buying a number of different investment properties in different states and spreading, or would you suggest pouring as much money as possible into your own occupied home, or even selling investment properties and putting more into an owner occupied home?
Okay, so there is no right or wrong answer to that. There are many different answers. So not only am I a lecturer in property, but I'm also an investor. I have sold investment property to upgrade my own home, because the beauty is, providing you don't overspend, it's not like you're losing the money. All right, you lose the money in paying tax and transaction fees, but you're putting that money into another property and you can borrow against that. So I'd suggest you need to speak to a QPIA, which is a qualified property investment advisor, and they can give you advice for your own situation. But location is so important in property. I'm more comfortable in investing in Adelaide and South Australia because it's my own backyard. I know it really well. Fortunately, Adelaide has done pretty well in the last 20 years compared to other capital cities. Will it still be at the top of the list in 20 years' time? Who knows? Because picking cities is more of a macroeconomic puzzle. I'm more of a property economist that focuses on the property side of things. So I reckon I'm pretty good at picking suburbs, but I'm not so good at picking the best cities to invest in for the next 10 or 15 years.
Have we got any more? I'm so surprised. I thought there'd be 500 hands up here. Oh, we have one from online.
Yes, I have an online question. The impact of nuclear submarines base in Adelaide, which suburbs are of key interest for investment?
What an interesting question. So 5 or 6 of my suburbs were on the Lefevre Peninsula. North Haven, Largs North, Exeter, Ethelton, Glanville, Semaphore Park. One of the reasons I picked them was because you remember the air warfare destroyers? Remember we started to build those 15 years ago? So I thought not only are they by the sea and there's gentrification, but this is also going to help. Well, it didn't help significantly. And so unless they're going to employ a lot more people in the submarine projects than they did in the air warfare destroyers, and don't forget submarines won't start to be built for another 10 years, I don't see that having as big an impact as the fact that they are by the sea. So, and the other thing is, like a lot of the people that come to work at the Submarine Corps don't necessarily have to live there. Many of them come from overseas. They're used to living in the city. They'll come and live in the city here. The fact that it's 30 minutes away, it's nothing for them because they used to do that back home. Or other suburbs, other more premium beachside suburbs, because don't forget a lot of these people earn good money, so they might go live at Glenelg or Brighton or Seacliff, Henley Beach, Grange, Tennyson. So in 10 words or less, I don't think it's going to have a really big impact on property prices. Don't know if that was 10 words, but...
And we've got one up the back.
Just on the unit side of things, just wondering if you've got much of a view or opinion on rental units versus, say, Airbnb rental units.
Okay, so I mean, it depends on where you are. Like if you're in a holiday location, you're probably going to make good money from your Airbnb as compared to long-term rental accommodation. But there are other factors you need to consider, and that is the hassle. And it's an extra cost, because instead of somebody renting it out permanently for 12 months, you got to go there every, a few days or a week, or somebody has to go there, and if somebody else is going there, you've obviously got to pay them. So you just got to do your numbers. Obviously, people who do Airbnb continue to do it because it makes really good money. But I suspect it's based on the location that they're in and the type of property that they're renting. Microphone, Danny?
This will be unfortunately, because one of my only jobs is to make sure we end on time, I've already failed at. This will be our last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. My question is, last couple of months we've seen phenomenon of home builder company collapse in several places in Australia. In the near future, what is it likely that this phenomenon can have impact on housing market or property market in South Australia? Thank you.
Excellent question. So new supply of property is only 2% of the market. So I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on the whole property market, but it is going to continue to have an impact, because if you increase interest rates, it stops us from buying, but it also stops builders from building, because they generally have to borrow the money to build the properties. Because remember, we only pay them once they've done the work, right? So they pour the footings, they have to pay their people, they have to pay for the concrete, and they do that before we pay them. So that they have to borrow the money to do this. So unfortunately, I think we're going to see some more insolvencies in the building game. It won't have a huge impact on the whole market because it's only 2%. But for those poor people that are waiting for a house to be built, the fact that it takes 24 months instead of 12, that's an extra year's mortgage repayment. That's not included in the building contract. So yes, there will be an impact, but not necessarily on the whole residential property market.
Well, look, I think that beautifully wraps up another Research Tuesdays monthly lecture. Can we all put our hands together and thank Peter for such a great presentation? I have an answer for your question. Excellent.
And people will go, Peter, you must be joking. If you are looking for a long-term buy, Taparoo. Look at them all. Struth, says the bloke. Yeah? Because I used to play football against Taparoo. We were very scared when we played Taparoo High School. But the key about Taparoo, it's on the coast. Semaphore is very expensive. Largs Bay is very expensive. The area is renewing long term. But you need to stay beach side of Military Road. All right? Beach side of Military Road. There we go. There's one for free.
Thank you, Peter. and thank you to our audience for being so engaged tonight, both here and online as well. Later on, we'll put up a little bit of a link in case you want to provide any feedback that we can take into other talks that we do.
Scan that.
Thank you once again for coming tonight on a cold winter's night, and we hope to see you again. Good night.
Thank you.